The Hate of Jews, A Darkness Older Than Memory. This audio adaptation is based on the article The Hate of Jews by Sami Bsoul. There is a hatred so ancient that it has outlived empires, so persistent it has adapted to every culture, so irrational it survives even in the brightest ages of reason. It is the hatred of the Jews. No other people has been so endlessly accused, so consistently blamed, so violently punished for existing. We have been called both too rich and too poor, too powerful and too weak, too loyal and too foreign, too religious and too godless. The charges always contradict, but the verdict is always the same: guilty. This hatred has burned books and burned children. It has walled families into ghettos and marched them into gas chambers. It has spoken in the voice of priests and kings, mobs and generals, politicians and professors. It wears 1,000 masks, but behind them all, it is the same sneer, the same poison. And yet, here is the truth that should make every reader pause. This is not just a Jewish story. Anti-Semitism is humanity's oldest mirror. When societies fracture, when fear needs a face, when failure needs a scapegoat, the Jew appears. To study this hatred is to study the mechanisms of all hate. To understand it is to see how fragile civilization is, and how easily we can return to the abyss. But there is also something else here, something less expected: light. Because for all the centuries of persecution, Jews remain. They have sung songs in the shadows, taught their children in whispers, carried memory across deserts and oceans. They have rebuilt from ashes, again and again. The story of anti-Semitism is not only the story of hate, it is also the story of resilience, of hope stubborn enough to survive history itself. This article is not written to accuse, but to reveal. Not to wall us off from one another, but to open the door wider. If you let it, this story will ache in your bones. And I hope, light a small candle in your heart. Because in the end, the question is not only why the world has hated the Jews. The question is, what does this hatred reveal about us all? Why this article? There are articles you read to pass time, and articles you read to understand time itself. This is the second kind. Hatred of Jews is often treated as one of many prejudices, a branch on the poison tree of racism. But it is more than that. It is the root. It is the rehearsal hall where humanity has practiced fear, suspicion, and cruelty before unleashing them on others. For more than 3,000 years, Jews have been singled out, branded, and persecuted. Not always by the same enemies, not always for the same reasons, but always with the same consequence: the Jew as the convenient other, the outsider against whom society defines itself. When empires collapsed, the Jew was blamed. When kings sought power, the Jew was taxed, expelled, or killed. When disease spread, Jews were accused of poisoning wells. When economies faltered, Jews were scapegoated as both greedy bankers and secret conspirators. Even when Jews had no land, no army, no state, they were imagined as cosmic villains. But here is the paradox. In telling the story of this hatred, we are not only telling the story of Jews, we are telling the story of humanity's fear of itself. Because if hatred of Jews were truly about Jews, it would have died long ago. Instead, it adapts. Like a virus, it mutates. It survives Rome, it survives the Crusades, it survives the Enlightenment, it even survives Auschwitz. Why? Because the target is less important than the need for someone to blame, someone to push outside the circle of belonging. This article was not born out of academic curiosity. It was born out of urgency. Look around today. The chants on city streets, the online conspiracy theories spreading like wildfire, the synagogues guarded by soldiers, the children afraid to wear a Star of David in public. We live in a time when anti-Semitism is again rising, not on the margins, but in the mainstream. And when anti-Semitism rises, history warns us, other hatreds follow. To study anti-Semitism is not to obsess over Jewish suffering. It is to ask, why does humanity keep returning to this same abyss? And more importantly, how do we stop it? I did not write this article to accuse the world. I wrote it as an invitation, to see more clearly, to feel more deeply, and perhaps to act more bravely. If you are not Jewish, I ask you to walk through these pages not as a visitor to someone else's pain, but as a witness to humanity's recurring illness. If you are Jewish, I ask you to read not only with grief, but also with pride in the resilience that has defied every empire's attempt to erase the Jews. This article is not about despair. It is about recognition. Recognition of how hate works, and recognition of how light survives even in the darkest corners. That is why article exists, not only for Jews, but for anyone who still believes humanity can choose differently. The scapegoat mechanism. When something goes wrong in the human story, a famine, a plague, a war, a failed harvest, people look for a cause. Rarely do they say, it was chance, it was nature, it was our own mistakes. No, human beings crave clarity, and clarity is easiest when there is someone to blame. So we point the finger, we select a target, we invent an explanation. That target becomes the scapegoat. The word itself comes from the Bible. On the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the ancient Israelites placed their sins symbolically upon a goat and sent it out into the wilderness. It was a ritual of release, guilt transferred to an animal, then driven away. But what was meant as spiritual symbolism became a deadly human habit. Blame a person, a people, and cast them out. Every society has its scapegoats. In Europe, witches were burned to explain bad harvests. In Rwanda, Tutsis were massacred to purify the Hutu majority. In America, immigrants have often been blamed for unemployment or crime. But Jews, more than any other people, became the world's recurring scapegoat. Why? Partly because they were visible, yet distinct. Jews lived among the nations, yet apart. Their customs marked them, their refusal to assimilate entirely kept them different. That difference became dangerous. Whenever a society needed to expel its fears, the Jew was a convenient target. A plague strikes? Jews must have poisoned the wells. The king is bankrupt. Jews must have stolen the wealth. Society feels spiritually restless. Jews must be enemies of God. A conspiracy is imagined. Of course, the Jews must be behind it. Contradictions never mattered. Jews were accused of being both communists and capitalists, both rootless cosmopolitans and tribal nationalists. It wasn't about truth. It was about projection. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, "If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him." This was not a compliment. It was an X-ray of the scapegoat mechanism itself. The hatred of Jews tells us less about Jews, and far more about the societies that hate them. Consider this. In medieval Europe, most Jews were poor, confined to ghettos, denied land or professions. Yet they were imagined as secret puppet masters of kings. Centuries later, in Nazi Germany, Jews made up less than 1% of the population, with no army, no country, no weapons. And yet they were accused of plotting world domination. The scale of the lie reveals the scale of the need. People needed someone to embody their anger, their envy, their shame. Scapegoating does something seductive. It simplifies complexity. Instead of facing the terrifying truth that life is fragile and unpredictable, people convince themselves that all their suffering is the work of a single, malicious enemy. And if that enemy is destroyed, life will be perfect again. This is the fantasy. This is the lie. And it has never delivered anything but ashes. History shows that whenever societies turn to scapegoating, they not only destroy the scapegoat, they also destroy themselves. Spain expelled its Jews in 1492, and soon after fell into decline. Nazi Germany murdered 6 million Jews, but in the process brought about its own annihilation. The hatred outlived the haters, but the cost was millions of lives and wasted generations. The Jewish people became the scapegoat because they were enduring, visible, different, and stubbornly unwilling to disappear. And so humanity used them again and again as the canvas for its darkest fears. But if we strip away the lies, if we look past the projections, we discover the truth. The scapegoat mechanism tells us not about Jews, but about us, about the human need to explain chaos, to locate blame, to turn fear into violence. Understanding this is not merely history, it is survival. Because the same mechanism repeats today, with new scapegoats, new targets, new lies. To study anti-Semitism is to study the oldest operating system of hate, one still running, one still dangerous, one that must be exposed if humanity is ever to grow beyond it. From Pharaoh to Rome, every story has a beginning. Anti-Semitism does not begin with Hitler, nor with medieval Europe, nor even with Christianity. It begins in the very earliest civilizations, where Jews first encountered power. Pharaoh, fear of the different. The book of Exodus tells us of a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. In that short phrase lies the seed of something vast: memory lost, gratitude forgotten, suspicion awakened. The Israelites had come to Egypt as refugees, welcomed in a time of famine. They contributed, worked, lived among Egyptians. But with time, their difference, their language, their customs, their growing numbers, became a threat. Pharaoh looks upon them and says, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they join our enemies." Fear turns to policy. Suspicion becomes oppression. Enslavement begins. The logic is chillingly familiar. A minority grows visible, and suddenly it is imagined as a fifth column, loyal not to the land it inhabits, but to some imagined other. Pharaoh invents the first political anti-Semitism, the Jew as internal enemy, the permanent outsider, exile and survival. After liberation, the Israelites wandered, then settled, then built. But their God, invisible, abstract, demanding justice rather than sacrifice, set them apart from the polytheistic empires that surrounded them. They would not bow to idols, nor worship emperors, nor blend into the religious melting pots of the ancient world. For the Babylonians, this stubbornness marked them as troublemakers. For the Persians, curiosities. But for the Greeks and Romans, empires that demanded conformity to civic gods and emperor cults, Jewish distinctiveness was a challenge, even an insult. The Greeks, the clash of civilizations. When Alexander the Great's empire stretched across the known world, Hellenism, Greek culture, became the language of power. Philosophy, art, theater, gods in human form. Most conquered peoples adopted it willingly, but the Jews resisted. To Greek thinkers, this refusal was incomprehensible, even offensive. How dare these few tribes cling to an invisible god, reject statues, and claim their own laws above the universal wisdom of Greece? Jewish refusal was painted not as faith, but as arrogance. The stereotype of the Jew as aloof, stubborn, unwilling to mix, it begins here. In Alexandria, a city where Greeks and Jews lived side by side, anti-Semitic riots broke out. Greek writers describe Jews as misanthropes, haters of mankind. The accusation would echo for millennia. Jews do not merely reject idols, they reject humanity itself. Rome, power and suspicion. Then came Rome. Rome demanded obedience. Its emperors declared themselves gods. Its empire swallowed nations. Most bent the knee. Jews refused. To Roman eyes, Jewish practices looked strange, even threatening. Circumcision was mocked as barbaric. The Sabbath, a day of rest in a world that demanded endless labor, was ridiculed as laziness. Dietary laws were scorned, and their refusal to worship the emperor, treason. When Jews resisted Roman rule, Rome responded with fury. Jerusalem's temple was destroyed in 70 CE, the people scattered in what would become the Great Diaspora. Yet even in dispersion, suspicion followed. Romans branded Jews as atheists for denying the gods, as subversives for holding on to their laws, as clannish for maintaining community in foreign lands. The pattern emerges from Pharaoh to Rome. The pattern of anti-Semitism was established. The Jew as outsider, never fully part of the land they inhabit. The Jew as threat, too many, too loyal to themselves, too different. The Jew as subversive, undermining unity, refusing to conform. The Jew as eternal, even when expelled, even when scattered, still present, still inconvenient, still unassimilated. This is where anti-Semitism first revealed itself not as a passing prejudice, but as a durable idea. The Jew as a problem to be solved. Empires rose and fell, but the stereotype endured. And so, when later generations, medieval priests, nationalist politicians, Nazi ideologues, looked for their scapegoat, they did not invent something new. They reached back into a library of lies as old as Pharaoh. The tragedy is that it worked, again and again. The question is, why did humanity keep returning to the same well of hatred? And that is the story the rest of this article will tell. The Middle Ages, Myths and Blood. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, but also an age of fear. In a world of plagues, famines, and wars, explanations were scarce, science was absent, and superstition was abundant. Into this climate, Jews, already marked as outsiders, became the perfect vessel for society's darkest fantasies. The blood libel. It began in England, 1144, with the death of a boy named William of Norwich. His body was found, and whispers began. Jews had killed him for ritual purposes. The claim had no basis, no witnesses, no proof. But it was irresistible. The story spread, carried by priests, inflamed by mobs. From then on, the blood libel, the lie that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, would erupt across Europe. Each time a child went missing or was found dead, suspicion fell on Jews. Entire communities were slaughtered because of it. It was a myth too powerful to die because it fed two primal fears: the fear of the innocent violated and the fear of the foreigner hiding monstrous secrets. To accuse Jews of killing children was to mark them not only as enemies of Christianity, but of humanity itself, the poisoners. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing millions. No one understood disease. Panic searched for an explanation. Once again, Jews became the scapegoat. Accusations spread. Jews had poisoned the wells. Under torture, some confessed to crimes they had never committed. Entire Jewish communities were burned alive. In Strasbourg, 1349, 2,000 Jews were herded into a wooden house and set on fire. The city then passed a law forbidding Jews from living there for a century. The irony is bitter. Jews, who often lived in segregated ghettos, suffered from plague too. But reason had no place in the hysteria. Hatred demanded a target, and Jews were the ready-made answer. The ghetto walls. The word ghetto comes from Venice, 1516, when Jews were forced to live in a walled quarter of the city. Locked in at night, restricted in trade, excluded from professions, Jews were both visible and invisible, marked by their difference, yet denied the chance to participate fully in society. The ghetto was not just physical, it was psychological. It told Jews, "You are not part of us." And it told Christians, "They are a people apart, strange, dangerous, confined for your protection." What began as practical segregation became symbolic separation. Jews were painted as the perpetual stranger, even after centuries of living in the same land. The mask of religion. The church played a central role in sustaining these myths. In sermons, Jews were portrayed as Christ killers, cursed for eternity. Passion plays reenacted the crucifixion, with Jews cast as villains. Good Friday often became a day of violence against Jewish communities. Yet paradoxically, Jews were tolerated, not because they were loved, but because they were useful. Rulers often protected Jews for their economic role as moneylenders, a profession Christians were forbidden to practice by church law. This role, forced upon them, would later fuel accusations of greed, usury, and exploitation. The Jew as the eternal moneylender was born not from Jewish choice, but from Christian prohibition, a new face of the old hatred. By the end of the Middle Ages, the mask of anti-Semitism was fully developed. Religious, Jews as enemies of Christ, cursed people. Mythical, Jews as child killers and poisoners. Social, Jews as isolated, confined, clannish. Economic, Jews as greedy, controlling exploiters. Each was a lie, but together they formed a mythology so resilient it would outlast centuries, surviving into the modern age, mutating into nationalism, racial theory, and finally, industrialized genocide. The Middle Ages gave anti-Semitism its legends, and legends, once told often enough, begin to feel like truths. Even today, echoes of these lies can be found, whispered online, shouted in rallies, spray-painted on synagogue walls. The masks change, but the face beneath remains the same. Modern times, old hatred. The Enlightenment promised reason, liberty, and progress. It promised the triumph of human intellect over superstition. And yet, anti-Semitism survived, not in the shadows of ignorance, but dressed as logic, nationalism, and even science. Nationalism and the question of belonging. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European states were consolidating power, defining nations, and asking, who belongs? For Jews, the question was complicated. Many had lived in Europe for centuries, speaking the local language, contributing to society, and paying taxes, yet they were often still treated as strangers. Nationalists, seeking to define a pure people, depicted Jews as eternal outsiders, incapable of assimilation. The rhetoric was subtle but poisonous. Jews could join the nation, but their loyalty was suspect. They were simultaneously needed for commerce and feared for influence. They were inside yet outside, a living contradiction that fueled anxiety in the minds of both rulers and citizens. The Dreyfus Affair. One of the most notorious examples came from France, a country that prided itself on liberty, equality, and fraternity. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was accused of treason. Evidence was flimsy, testimony coerced, the trial biased, and yet the nation erupted in debate. The affair revealed the depth of anti-Semitism, even in a supposedly modern, rational society. Newspapers published anti-Jewish cartoons. Intellectuals argued over Dreyfus's guilt, often hiding prejudice behind appeals to patriotism. The phrase, "the Jew as enemy within," became a rallying cry. Dreyfus was eventually exonerated, but the scars remained. The Dreyfus Affair showed that hatred had learned to wear a mask of reason, appealing to logic while feeding centuries-old fear. Racial theories and pseudoscience. By the late 19th century, anti-Semitism took a new form, racial theory. No longer merely a religious or cultural difference, Jews were now described as a biological threat. Science claimed to categorize humans into superior and inferior races. Jews were portrayed as inherently cunning, greedy, and disloyal, traits supposedly written in their blood. Entire books and journals promoted these ideas, giving prejudice the appearance of objectivity. This scientific anti-Semitism would lay the groundwork for the 20th century's most catastrophic hate, the Holocaust. What had once been whispers in medieval villages had now been codified in textbooks, public policy, and political movements. Economic myths and modern hatred. Even as industrialization reshaped Europe, Jews were often accused of controlling finance, manipulating markets, and exploiting labor. These accusations ignored reality. Jews were a tiny fraction of bankers or business owners, but repetition made them truths in the public mind. What is remarkable and terrifying is the continuity. Medieval myths did not disappear. They transformed. The blood libel became the financial libel. Religious hatred became racial hatred. Social exclusion became political persecution. The mask changed, but the face beneath remained unchanged. A world on the edge. By the turn of the 20th century, anti-Semitism had become a force that could shape nations. It moved from church sermons to newspapers, from whispers to political platforms. In Eastern Europe, pogroms erupted with horrifying regularity. In Western Europe, intellectuals debated the Jewish question. And in Germany, a wounded empire saw in Jews both a convenient scapegoat and an existential threat, a narrative that would soon spiral into unimaginable horror. Modernity did not destroy anti-Semitism. It perfected it. It gave it tools, a vocabulary, and a veneer of legitimacy. It became systemic, adaptive, and deadly, capable of manipulating mass psychology with precision the medieval world could only dream of. The lesson is chilling. Hatred does not vanish with progress. It evolves. It waits for new forms, new voices, new technologies to carry it forward. And unless it is consciously confronted, it will continue to resurface in every age. The Holocaust. Industrialized hate at its extreme. If history is a river, the Holocaust is its darkest whirlpool, a place where centuries of lies, myths, and prejudice converged into unimaginable destruction. For thousands of years, Jews had been outsiders, scapegoats, and targets. Medieval blood libels, expulsions, economic myths, and racial theories all created a mythology of fear and hatred. But no previous century had had the machinery to turn those myths into total annihilation. The machinery of hate. The Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism. They inherited it. They inherited centuries of prejudice that had painted Jews as enemies of God, nation, and society. But they perfected it with technology, bureaucracy, and propaganda. Jews were stripped of rights, removed from schools, banned from professions. Their businesses were confiscated, synagogues were burned, newspapers and films told the population that Jews were parasites, enemies, conspirators. The message was relentless. The Jew is dangerous. The Jew must be removed. The machinery extended beyond ideology. Railroads carried victims to ghettos and death camps. Factories and gas chambers converted hate into industry. The Holocaust was the logical, horrific endpoint of a hatred that had evolved over millennia. Faces of the tragedy. Yet the Holocaust is not only a story of numbers. It is the story of faces, names, lives. A little girl clutching a doll in Lodz, an old man praying in a ghetto, a family torn apart in Krakow, a young doctor forced to watch horror in Auschwitz. Millions of stories, each cut short, each leaving an absence impossible to measure. The human cost is beyond comprehension, but it must be felt, not only counted. The persistence of myth. Even during the Holocaust, the lies persisted. Propaganda claimed that Jews were plotting world domination, hoarding wealth, spreading disease. In other words, centuries-old myths were recycled, updated, and weaponized. The same false narratives that had caused expulsions and pogroms centuries earlier became justification for industrialized murder. The lesson of extremity. The Holocaust teaches a fundamental, terrifying truth. When hatred is systematized, when myths are codified into law, when fear is amplified into obedience, ordinary societies can commit extraordinary crimes. It was not only the product of monsters, it was facilitated by bureaucrats, neighbors, and ordinary citizens swept up in the tide, survival against all odds. And yet, even here, light persisted. Jews survived in forests, in ghettos, through false papers, through acts of courage and cunning. Stories of resistance, armed, spiritual, and intellectual, remind us that hatred cannot erase humanity entirely. The Holocaust is not only a story of destruction, it is also a story of endurance, of the refusal to vanish in the face of overwhelming evil. This is a thread that runs through the Jewish experience from Pharaoh to the modern era, survival against impossible odds, the continuation of memory, and the stubborn insistence on life. After Auschwitz, denial, distortion, and lingering prejudice. The liberation of the camps in 1945 revealed the unimaginable: charred corpses, emaciated survivors, crematoria, and a silence that screamed across the world. For a moment, it seemed as if the depth of human cruelty had been fully exposed, a final warning against anti-Semitism. And yet, the world moved on. And anti-Semitism did too. Denial and revision. Almost immediately, the lies returned. Holocaust denial began, claiming that the genocide was exaggerated, that the numbers were inflated, that the deaths never happened. Denial is not a simple mistake. It is an attempt to erase truth, to free the old myths of Jews as enemies from the consequences of history. Even distortion took subtler forms. Some reduced the Holocaust to statistics, abstract numbers, detached from human suffering. Others transformed it into a political weapon, comparing policies or accusing Jews themselves of manipulating memory. The narratives were twisted, but the purpose remained the same: to reduce the Jew to a symbol of fear, power, or guilt, lingering prejudice. Survivors returned to towns and cities often indifferent or hostile. Pogroms in Poland after the war forced many Jews to flee once again. In other countries, prejudice lingered in subtler forms: quotas in universities, suspicion in workplaces, exclusion from social circles. Centuries of ingrained myth could not be erased by law alone. In some places, anti-Semitism became less visible, but no less real. It moved underground, to whispers, coded language, jokes, and stereotypes. The world, scarred by genocide, still struggled to confront the persistence of the ancient hatred. The global dimension. Post-war anti-Semitism was not confined to Europe. In the Middle East, Jews faced expulsions, pogroms, and nationalization of property. In the Americas, anti-Semitic quotas and social barriers remained. Even as the Jewish state of Israel was established in 1948, anti-Semitism adapted to the new geopolitical realities, often entwined with politics and ideology. The warning. The period after Auschwitz teaches a sobering lesson. Witnessing horror does not guarantee understanding. Even when the evidence is undeniable, anti-Semitism can persist, reinvented in new forms, finding new excuses, feeding new fears. Survivors became witnesses, educators, and moral guides. Their stories remind the world, hatred left unexamined can regenerate. Memory is not enough. Awareness, reflection, and action are essential. A thread of continuity. From Pharaoh to Rome, from medieval ghettos to modern Europe, from pseudoscientific racial theories to industrialized murder, the pattern is clear. Anti-Semitism is not random. It is resilient. It adapts. It survives. And it will endure unless humanity consciously resists it. This chapter is not only a reckoning with the past, it is a call to vigilance, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with drums and torches. Sometimes it whispers in the background, camouflaged in politics, culture, or rhetoric. The lesson is stark. History will repeat if the human heart does not learn. The new anti-Semitism, internet, politics, Middle East, conspiracies. If history teaches anything, it is that anti-Semitism never disappears. It mutates. It adapts. Today, the hatred that once fueled pogroms and propaganda has found new avenues. The internet, global politics, and enduring myths recycled in new forms. Digital virulence. The rise of the internet and social media has given anti-Semitism a megaphone unlike any in history. Lies that once spread through town criers or newspapers now traverse continents in seconds. Conspiracy theories, secret control of banks, manipulation of governments, orchestration of pandemics proliferate endlessly online. Memes, posts, and videos simplify centuries of myth into catchy viral messages. Ancient stereotypes are repackaged for modern consumption. The Jew as banker, as manipulator, as puppet master. The technology is new, but the narrative is old. Politics and polarization. Anti-Semitism today is no longer confined to the far right. It exists across the spectrum. On one side, extremists demonize Jews as global financiers, exploiting capitalism. On the other, some accuse Jews of exploiting power, media, or politics to advance agendas, often under the guise of anti-Zionism. The danger lies in subtlety. Modern anti-Semitism is frequently couched in political critique, yet it perpetuates the same myths and stereotypes that have caused centuries of persecution. Its mask is plausible deniability, but the core prejudice endures. Middle East conflicts. The re-establishment of Israel in 1948 and the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict added a new dimension. Criticism of Israeli policies is legitimate. Hatred of Jews as a people is not. Yet the two are often blurred, giving rise to modern anti-Semitism framed as geopolitical critique. Across the globe, Jews are attacked for the actions of a state they may have never visited or supported. Old myths, disloyalty, conspiracy, collective guilt are recycled in new contexts, proving once again that anti-Semitism is more than history. It is a living ideology, the psychology of modern hate. Despite the sophistication of modern societies, fear and projection continue to drive hatred. When individuals or groups face economic uncertainty, social change, or political unrest, they still search for a scapegoat, and history provides an ancient target, the Jew, eternally adaptable to the anxieties of the majority. Modern anti-Semitism is clever, pervasive, and often invisible. It hides in jokes, in subtle rhetoric, in academic discourse, and online commentary. Unlike the medieval mob, it often wears a suit or tweets from an anonymous account. Yet its impact is real. Violence, discrimination, exclusion, and the perpetuation of myths that poison the social body. Continuity and change. What is striking is the continuity. Medieval blood libels, early modern economic myths, 19th century racial theories, and Nazi ideology all echo today's stereotypes. Only the mask has changed. The engine remains the same. Understanding the new anti-Semitism requires vigilance. It is not always dramatic or overt. It is often embedded in casual assumptions, viral conspiracy theories, or political rhetoric, and its danger lies not only in harming Jews, but in corroding the moral fabric of society itself. A call to awareness. The new anti-Semitism is a reminder that the past is never past. The myths, lies, and fears that fueled centuries of hatred are not buried in history books. They are alive, waiting to be told again. Recognizing them is the first step toward resisting them. This chapter closes part 2, leaving a stark truth. Anti-Semitism is not a relic of the past. It is a persistent, evolving force. To confront it, we must understand its history, its psychology, and its ability to adapt. Only then can we begin to break the cycle. Hate repeats itself. Hatred is a mirror. When societies hate one group, they reveal something deeper about themselves: fear, envy, insecurity, and the need for control. Anti-Semitism is humanity's oldest mirror, and when we study it, we see more than a Jewish tragedy. We see a universal lesson. Patterns across history. From Pharaoh to modern Europe, the pattern is unmistakable. 1. Fear of the other. Whenever societies feel threatened, whether by disease, economic crisis, or social change, they look for someone to blame. Jews, historically visible yet distinct, have often filled that role. 2. Scapegoating. Blame simplifies complexity. Societies prefer a single target over confronting their own failures. The scapegoat becomes a lightning rod for frustration, rage, and fear. 3. Myth-making. Legends, rumors, and stereotypes justify persecution. The blood libel, the greedy financier, the secret conspirator all demonstrate how imagination can become justification. 4. Institutionalization. Laws, propaganda, and social norms embed prejudice into daily life. Once sanctioned by authority, hate becomes routine, normalized, and generational. 5. Adaptation. Hatred survives by changing its mask. Religious prejudice became racial theory. Medieval pogroms became modern political campaigns. Myths now circulate on social media. This cycle repeats because it is not about truth. Hatred is not rational. It is performative. It exists to express collective fear and to claim moral or social superiority. Beyond anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the oldest example, but the mechanism repeats in countless other forms. Xenophobia against immigrants, racism against minority populations, anti-Black or anti-Indigenous prejudice, political scapegoating in times of crisis, and so on. The lesson is clear. Any society that tolerates the scapegoating of one group risks repeating history on other fronts. Anti-Semitism is a warning sign, a canary in the coal mine of collective morality. Psychology of hate. Hatred also reveals the human psyche. Fear triggers projection. Envy triggers accusation. Insecurity triggers aggression. Societies repeat these patterns because they are human, not because the target is justified. This understanding transforms our response. It is not enough to oppose hate superficially. We must understand its roots in fear and projection, learn to recognize the patterns, and intervene before they become destructive. A universal call. The story of anti-Semitism is not only about the Jewish people, it is about all humanity. To read it is to look into the mechanisms of hate, to see the threads that connect past and present, and to understand how prejudice can erupt anywhere, against anyone, unless it is consciously resisted. Hate repeats itself not because the world lacks morality, but because fear, envy, and projection are part of the human condition. Awareness, memory, and moral courage are the tools to break the cycle. In this chapter, the reader begins to see the shift. The story of Jews is also a story of all of us. The same lessons that could save Jewish lives in history can save societies today and tomorrow. The anatomy of prejudice. Hatred is not born in a vacuum. It grows in minds, communities, and systems. To understand anti-Semitism, and by extension all prejudice, we must examine its anatomy, the psychological triggers, social reinforcements, and structural mechanisms that allow it to flourish. 1. Psychological roots. At its core, prejudice thrives on fear and projection. People often fear what they do not understand. Uncertainty, loss, and change trigger anxiety. The human mind seeks simple explanations, and the scapegoat offers clarity. Projection. Societies project their insecurities onto a target. Jews, historically visible yet distinct, became the canvas for others' fears, blamed for everything from plagues to economic crises. Stereotyping. Simplifying complex individuals into fixed traits makes them easier to fear. The Jew was simultaneously greedy, cunning, arrogant, and disloyal, contradictions ignored because they served the narrative. Dehumanization. Once the target is othered, empathy declines. Dehumanization allows ordinary people to justify violence, exclusion, or discrimination. 2. Social reinforcement. Prejudice is contagious. Families, schools, religious institutions, and peer groups transmit ideas across generations. Conformity and authority. People often adopt hateful beliefs to align with social norms or authority figures. From medieval priests to modern politicians, endorsement amplifies bias. Echo chambers. Communities reinforce beliefs internally while rejecting contradictory evidence. Historically, myths about Jews spread within towns, then across kingdoms. Today, social media magnifies this effect globally. Rituals and symbols. Cultural practices, holidays, plays, textbooks, or propaganda can embed prejudice into everyday life, making it invisible yet persistent. 3. Structural and institutional mechanisms. Prejudice survives when it is embedded in systems. Laws and policies, restrictive laws, forced ghettos, quotas, and discriminatory regulations institutionalize bias. Even after explicit policies end, structural disadvantages persist. Economic exploitation. Assigning marginalized groups to certain professions or blaming them for economic crises reinforces stereotypes and resentment. Media and propaganda. From pamphlets and newspapers to TV and social media, controlled narratives shape perceptions, often distorting truth to justify prejudice. 4. The feedback loop. Psychology, society, and institutions interact in a cycle. Fear creates myths. Myths gain social acceptance. Social reinforcement encourages institutionalization. Institutions validate prejudice, and validation feeds fear again. This feedback loop explains why anti-Semitism is so resilient. It adapts to every era, every technology, every ideology, because it is not merely a collection of false ideas. It is a system embedded in human perception and social organization. 5. Breaking the cycle. Understanding the anatomy of prejudice is empowering. Recognition is the first step to resistance. By identifying the psychological triggers, social reinforcements, and structural supports of hate, societies can intervene before hatred escalates into violence. Education, empathy, and critical thinking are antidotes. Awareness disrupts myths, dialogue counters stereotypes, and accountability challenges institutions that perpetuate bias. 6. Lessons for all humanity. The story of anti-Semitism teaches a universal truth. All prejudice follows similar patterns. The same fear, projection, stereotyping, and institutionalization that target Jews can target any minority. By dissecting the anatomy of prejudice, we gain a blueprint, not only for understanding the Jewish experience, but for understanding the roots of hatred everywhere. Awareness allows prevention, memory allows vigilance, action allows survival, resilience, and renewal. For millennia, Jews have lived under the shadow of hatred, persecution, and exile. From Pharaoh to modern times, they have been scapegoated, expelled, and attacked. And yet, through it all, they have survived, rebuilt, and renewed themselves again and again. Resilience is not just survival. It is adaptation, creativity, and the determination to maintain identity and humanity in the face of relentless adversity. 1. The strength of memory. Central to Jewish survival is memory. History, law, and tradition have preserved lessons from one generation to the next. The Torah, Talmud, and other texts do more than guide religious life. They preserve moral frameworks, communal cohesion, and ethical reflection. Rituals like Passover and Yom Kippur remind communities of liberation, justice, and responsibility, turning memory into moral vigilance. Memory becomes a shield. It prevents forgetting, demands accountability, and inspires resistance against oppression. 2. Cultural and intellectual renewal. Even in exile, Jews have contributed disproportionately to philosophy, science, art, and literature. Their creativity often emerges under conditions of constraint. In medieval Spain, Jewish scholars bridged Islamic and Christian knowledge, preserving classical texts. In Eastern Europe, Yiddish literature and theater thrived despite poverty and oppression. In the modern era, Jewish thinkers have shaped science, ethics, law, and the arts globally. This renewal shows that resilience is not merely reactive, it is generative. Hatred may attempt to destroy, but human creativity persists. 3. Community as lifeline. Community has been both protection and sustenance. Synagogues, schools, and charitable organizations have provided social cohesion, education, and aid in times of crisis. Even when forced into ghettos or refugee camps, Jews maintained cultural and religious practices, preserving identity in hostile environments. Communities became engines of continuity, a living testimony that survival requires connection, solidarity, and shared purpose. 4. Adaptation and innovation. History demanded flexibility. Jewish survival required adapting to new languages, economies, and political systems while preserving core identity. Diasporic Jews blended into diverse societies while maintaining cultural and religious cohesion. In modern times, Jewish communities have embraced technology, global networks, and education to thrive even amid adversity. Resilience is thus both steadfastness and adaptability, a balance between holding core values and responding to change. 5. Lessons for humanity. The Jewish experience of resilience offers universal lessons. Memory protects against repetition. Remember history to prevent its mistakes. Community fosters survival. Solidarity strengthens individuals and societies. Adaptation preserves identity. Flexibility allows continuity without surrendering values. Creativity sustains hope. Even under oppression, human ingenuity shines. Anti-Semitism is ancient, pervasive, and dangerous. But the story of Jewish survival shows that even the most relentless hatred cannot fully extinguish life, culture, or memory. 6. The promise of renewal. This resilience is a light in the darkness. It is not a mere relic of the past. It is an example for every society facing hatred today. If communities can endure centuries of violence and prejudice, there is hope for all humans who seek to resist fear, oppression, and division. Through resilience, renewal, and moral courage, the Jewish people have transformed tragedy into lessons, survival into wisdom, and memory into a beacon. This chapter is not just about the Jews. It is about the possibility of humanity rising above hatred, choosing life, and keeping hope alive. Allies and friendship. Even in the most harrowing moments of history, one truth endures. The Jewish people were never entirely alone. Acts of courage, friendship, and moral conviction by non-Jews have lit the darkest times, proving that human decency can resist hatred. 1. Righteous among the nations. During the Holocaust, tens of thousands risked their lives to save Jews. Known as the righteous among the nations, these individuals hid families in attics, forged documents, and guided escape routes. Oskar Schindler, a businessman, saved over 1,000 Jews by employing them in his factories. Irina Sendler, a Polish social worker, smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, giving them new identities. Ordinary neighbors, teachers, and clergy often took extraordinary risks to protect their fellow humans. These acts remind us that courage is not reserved for heroes in history books. It exists in everyday choices to act morally, even when fear and danger loom. 2. Solidarity across communities. Solidarity is not only individual. Communities, organizations, and movements have stood against anti-Semitism. During pogroms, some local citizens shielded Jewish neighbors, protested violence, or provided refuge. In the modern era, interfaith groups, human rights organizations, and educational initiatives have worked to combat hatred, defend minorities, and promote understanding. Friendship and alliance across differences are powerful antidotes to isolation, fear, and prejudice. History shows that hate thrives where humanity withdraws. It falters where courage and empathy prevail. 3. Moral lessons. Allies teach a profound lesson. Hatred is not inevitable. Even in societies steeped in prejudice, individuals and groups can make choices that resist the tide of fear, suspicion, and cruelty. Friendship is active, not passive. It requires speaking out, taking risks, and sometimes defying laws or social norms to uphold justice. These acts of solidarity amplify hope and demonstrate the moral agency each person possesses. 4. Beyond survival. The presence of allies is more than a survival strategy. It is a moral testament. It shows that even when hatred is widespread, empathy and courage can create islands of light. These examples ripple outward, inspiring new generations to reject prejudice and embrace humanity. 5. Universal implication. The story of allies is a universal call. Combating hate is not the responsibility of the persecuted alone. Every society, every individual has a role in resisting injustice. Hatred can be countered when people choose connection over division, courage over fear, and empathy over apathy. Through acts of friendship and alliance, humanity proves that it can transcend centuries of prejudice. These lights, small yet persistent, illuminate a path forward. They remind us that the choice between hatred and humanity is not abstract. It is personal, daily, and transformative. A candle in the dark. History is long, and its shadows are deep. For millennia, the Jewish people have faced persecution, exile, and violence. Anti-Semitism has adapted, persisted, and evolved, a reminder that hate is not merely a problem of the past. Yet even in the darkest chapters, there is light. There are stories of survival, solidarity, courage, and moral conviction. This light is fragile, but it is powerful. It is a candle in the dark, small yet capable of dispelling fear and inspiring hope. The power of choice. Every individual has the power to resist hatred. History shows that evil requires participation or silence to thrive. Choosing humanity, even when it is difficult, interrupts the machinery of prejudice. Speak when lies are told. Stand when injustice occurs. Learn when ignorance spreads. Even small acts of courage ripple outward. They light other candles. They create communities resistant to hate. They remind the world that morality is an action, not an abstraction. Memory as moral compass. Remembering the past is not only an act of preservation, it is a moral imperative. By understanding the history of anti-Semitism, from Pharaoh to the modern era, we recognize the warning signs of hatred, and we are empowered to act before it escalates. Memory nurtures vigilance. It reminds us that prejudice begins in whispers, grows in silence, and becomes deadly when unchallenged. Every story remembered is a warning, a lesson, and a testament to human resilience. Light in community. Light is rarely solitary. Friends, allies, and communities amplify courage. Acts of solidarity, protecting the vulnerable, fostering dialogue, resisting injustice, are beacons that pierce the darkness. History teaches that the oppressed cannot stand alone. Human decency thrives when it is shared, when communities commit to justice, and when societies value empathy over fear. Choosing humanity. Hate is a choice, so is love. Prejudice is learned, so is compassion. Fear can be resisted, so can courage be embraced. Every action matters, every decision contributes, every life touches another. To choose humanity is to actively resist stereotypes, to confront injustice, to listen and understand. It is to see others not as scapegoats or symbols, but as fellow humans, deserving of dignity, empathy, and respect. This article began with darkness, the ache of centuries of hatred, violence, and scapegoating, but it ends with light. Even a small candle can illuminate an entire room. Even a single act of courage can inspire generations. Hatred may persist, but it is not inevitable. Memory, empathy, solidarity, and action are stronger than fear. The Jewish story is a testament not only to survival, but to the enduring possibility of hope. Let this candle guide us. Let it remind us that while hate may be ancient, compassion is timeless. Light one candle, and you resist the darkness. Light many, and you illuminate the world. Look at history. Look closely. The hatred of Jews is older than nations, older than empires, older than most of the institutions we trust to protect us. It is a hatred that survives plagues, wars, revolutions, and enlightenment. It wears many masks: religious, racial, economic, political, digital, but always it seeks the same thing: to deny a people their humanity. It is not polite, it is not accidental. It is deliberate, persistent, and adaptive. It begins quietly, a rumor, a joke, a stereotype, and ends in devastation. Whole communities vanish. Families are erased. Memory itself is at risk. And yet, despite centuries of violence, Jews have endured. They have rebuilt cities, books, schools, lives. They have survived exile, oppression, and genocide. Their survival is stubborn, luminous, and uncompromising. This hatred is not a story of the past. It is alive. It exists in whispered conspiracy theories, in virulent propaganda online, in casual assumptions, in societies that fail to confront it. It exists wherever fear outweighs reason, prejudice outweighs empathy, and silence outweighs action. We cannot pretend it does not exist. We cannot hide from it. To look away is to participate. To forget is to repeat. To fail to act is to let darkness grow. The story of anti-Semitism is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror. It asks each of us, what will you do when the hatred rises again? How will you respond when myths and fear seek a target? Will you stay silent, or will you see and act and remember? Hatred against the Jews is ancient, persistent, and unrelenting, and the choice to resist it, to confront it, to understand it, to break its cycle, lies with us, today and every day thereafter. The world can choose light, but only if we refuse to look away.